We are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. In the 19th century, all Native Americans were banned from living within the city of Seattle limits. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 forced the Chinese population onto a steamer ship out of the city. In 1942, Executive Order 9066 sent the Japanese community into concentration camps, leaving their land and property up for grabs. And as the city of Seattle grew, racial exclusions and covenants were placed on property deeds. For over half the 20th century, non-whites were segregated or redlined into specific areas of the city. Institutionalized discrimination in banking practices restricted this population even more, hindering them from building home equity wealth and growing their businesses in the same manner and ease as their white counterparts.
Here's how redlining works. Lending institutions refused to lend money for reasons like the house was considered too old, the neighborhood had too many different kinds of racial and ethnic groups, the neighborhood is a mixture of houses and businesses.
In the 21st century, these historically redlined neighborhoods face a new tension. As all property in Seattle becomes more valuable, the communities that were able to establish a foothold in their neighborhoods are being pushed out by the same market and policy forces that limited them there. At the Northwest African American Museum, artists, activists, advocates, and the Seattle community discuss how that red line still runs through our city today.
Hello and welcome to your Northwest African American Museum. I am Lanisha DeBartoleben, Executive Director, and on behalf of our board, our staff, and our members, we thank you, each of you, for attending our program tonight. And to moderate the conversation tonight, we are so pleased to have community leader Leilani Lewis as our moderator. I'll tell you a bit about Ms. Lewis. She is a Seattle-born creative arts administrator and communications professional who is passionate about social justice, art, and culture. As a board member of the Northwest African American Museum, as well as the Seattle Arts and Lectures, Ms. Lewis is a dedicated steward of the arts community with a specific focus on QT by POC, liberation and power. A Seattle University alumna and a graduate of Leadership Tomorrow, Ms. Lewis's work is driven by her strongly held values of compassionate leadership, creating connections across difference, and lifting as we climb. She is truly an activist and a leader and a community advocate extraordinaire. And we are so fortunate to have her on our board here at NAAM and to have her moderating the conversation tonight. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Leilani Lewis.
Okay. Thank you, Lanisha. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited and honored to be here today to welcome these wonderful panelists. And I told them earlier, and this is true, the less I speak, the better the panel will be. So I hope we have a fruitful discussion. We're going to get started here, but just know that if you have questions going forward, if you hear comments, you have something to say, please write them down or keep them in your thoughts, and we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. I want to start too by saying an acknowledgement of the land that we are on. We are on the land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. This is important to acknowledge ahead of programs that we are on stolen land, and this is something that I want to bring into the room. And with that, we can get started. We have here Jake Prendez, Steven Sawada, Warren Pope, and Sochi Makovich. All wonderful experts in their own right, and very honored to be speaking with you today. So we're going to get started with introductions, and if you could tell me your name, preferred pronoun, and whatever you'd like to say about your current work and the organizations you're involved with. And we'll start with you, Sochi.
My name is Sochi Makovich. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work as the political director for Washington Community Action Network, which is a grassroots organization that does a lot of work around housing, in particular around tenant rights. And I think the big thing that we did this year so far is we're one of the leaders in pushing eviction reform. So if you're a renter, July 28th, a lot of policies are about to change. So keep that in mind.
Thank you.
I'm Warren Pope. I'm currently the artist that's exhibiting with bloodlines, timelines, and redlines. The exhibit will be up till September 8th. It's what I do for a living, plus I am a landscaper and a father of two, and I am enjoying the privilege at this time of being here at your museum. I appreciate most of the positive feedback I've gotten. It's encouraging. And people seem to be moved and are understanding exactly what it is that I'm trying to portray. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Sawada. I am one of the organizers with the CID Coalition. We also go by the hashtag Humbaus Not Hotels. We formed about 2.5 years ago, and I'm sure we'll tell you a little bit more about our organization throughout the evening, but I just wanted to kind of give a shout out for a lot of the members who recently participated in the Coast to Coast Chinatown Solidarity Network, where we had a lot of activism across Chinatowns across the country and North America.
Hello, I'm Jake Prendez. I'm a Chicano artist and the owner-operator of Napantla Cultural Arts Gallery on the border of White Center and West Seattle. We've been open since February, so we're still a very new art gallery, cultural space. We have one wall that changes exhibitions every month, but always focused on marginalized communities. We have a really cool gift shop, and then it's also a cultural space where we host open mic nights. We run a youth arts program called the Próxima Generación Youth Artist Residency with Northwest Folklife. We host open mic nights, arts workshops, and different things for community that are free. And I've basically been in between Seattle and LA my whole life. So I was born in California and was raised in Bothell, and then went to UW, graduated and did my master's in Chicano Studies at Cal State Northridge, stayed and was in kind of the East LA area for about 15 years and moved back to Seattle 3 years ago.
Thank you, thank you. So the conversation today, we're talking about, in some ways, how values shape policy and how policies shape the areas we live in. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work, specifically your entry into thinking about advocacy, your artwork, and organizing, and where you sort of entered the conversation? And I'll kick it to Jake to start.
Oh. So I think for most of the time in LA, I was more on the sidelines. Not owning property, and more, like I said, observer, but a passionate observer, I would say, where I organized and did work with different organizations to fight gentrification, and saw what was happening with displacement, especially in Silver Lake, Echo Park, Highland Park, where I lived. And then, as an artist, kind of being in this environment, this kind of the Chicano art scene, and how do I apply to that? Where do I intersect in this kind of gentrification fight when you have galleries that are kind of problematic in kind of the process of gentrification, and it's like, but that's my skill set. And so it's kind of where do I cross the line? You know, I'm a community artist. So it was kind of difficult. And then when I moved here, to see kind of the same trends starting to happen, but almost a step behind and kind of almost coming into it. It's like, I've seen what happens, you know, and now being, you know, a business owner in White Center and being a community advocate, seeing it from really a whole new perspective, and it, you know, and applying that to community and how do we fight displacement of our community in different areas.
Warren, you have a wonderful exhibit out in the Northwest Gallery, and if you haven't seen it, please go see it before you leave tonight or come back to NAAM. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you entered this, this topic and what's inspired you?
Social justice has always been to the forefront, something of my interest. Being half and half, growing up that way. The first place I came to in the United States was Kansas. Having a white mother and a black father, and experienced segregation, but having the option of actually passing. So, to make it short, when I go into a tavern, I hear a lot of things. And usually I refer to it as the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Because when I used to get tickets when I was young, the officer always put in W. He asked me for my weight. Sometimes it was nighttime, the color of my eyes, but he always assumed I was white. With that lesson, at a pretty early age, living on Army bases, you never had a choice of who your neighbor was. Moving off the Army base, oh well, I remember getting off the plane in LaGuardia, and the first thing my uncle did was pick us up, and we went to Harlem. As far as redlining, what did they do with the Indians? I think they called it reservations. It's not a new idea. And having been raised that way, I was always aware of it. There were times when I felt a lot of guilt playing that other card, the race card. Oh, well, there's two. There's one that's black and one that's white. Well, which one are you going to play? I don't have a problem with housing, but I knew there was a problem. That inspiration out there, that's an accumulation of, there's a couple of pieces there, the American Legacy piece, that was done 14 years ago. I did a political cartoon 25 years ago. Ticker tape all over the floor, a tattered flag up on the wall, 3-piece suits, and it was called The Selling of America. There's been a thing in me that undermines the idea that you just do art for money. Because I know a lot of those pieces, I don't care if they're ever bought, I want them to be seen. There's a consciousness that I want to reach. I want to pull you in with beauty, because most of what I do, I love beauty. I love flowers, I buy fresh flowers. Trader Joe's is the best place for the price. You know it is. But once I draw you in, like children die in drive-bys, I want to punch you in the gut. Because we all should have some sort of consciousness about what's happening around us. It's not healthy. It wasn't healthy for me as I was a young boy, and it can't possibly be healthy for you. And part of this exhibit is not to just expose what is happening here, it's to embarrass Seattle. Seattle, you're not liberal. Too many conservative talk show hosts made a huge living here. A couple of them live on Mercer Island. Why is that? And every liberal talk show has gone under. Seattle is not liberal. And part of that exhibit has got a 3.5 theme that is not really explained. 3.5 is the population of black in Washington. The piece that's in there with 300 ping pong balls, there's 10.5 that are black and 1 half black. That's me. If the city of Seattle and the state of Washington felt it was intimidated to the point of voting down affirmative action because 289.5 people felt threatened by 10.5, you're not liberal. You're shameful. And my whole exhibit is about that. It's not about trying to pound my chest, because I love most of the people I've known, and most of the people here I'm sure I would. But to get on this facade of not addressing what it really is shameful. And it hurts me to see our neighborhoods just being demolished. And most of it isn't addressed because of most of it, a lot of it in the Seattle area is through foreign investment. It's selling out. And I just don't like it. And therefore, I worked on this thing hard. I had the privilege of bringing it to this museum. But it's been a passion of mine. And the museum knows, because I've solicited this museum as long as 3-4 years ago. And sometimes I thought maybe they think I'm crazy.
Thank you for your.
But you know what? I'm not.
Thank you. And thank you for your persistence in making sure that the exhibit got seen. Okay, Sochi, would you like to tell us a little more?
Yeah, I think the first time that housing really crossed my mind was several years ago when I was in college in North Carolina. I worked a full-time minimum wage job to make sure I could survive. And that entire time while I was trying to go to school and work, like just paying rent, and even just North Carolina rent was incredibly stressful. And I remember, and I'll never forget this, and this is like definitely guided a lot of my work, was there was a freak snowstorm. And one similarity between Seattle and North Carolina is when there's snow, everyone just stops everything. Which the negative for me on that was that I didn't get paid, right? So I lost 3 days of money. And I couldn't pay rent on time. And I that year, very rarely paid rent on time. I'd write that check, float it, be like, please don't clear until this day. I'm sure many of you have been in that place. But it was too far for me to do that. And so I was getting late fees, and I was like, oh my God, what's gonna happen if I get evicted, right? And that feeling has always stayed with me. And what I did was I got a payday loan, which is like, I know that this is a bad idea, but like this is less terrifying than potentially getting evicted. And after, I worked in a school for a little bit, I worked in a law firm for a little bit, and then I started doing organizing work, and the opportunity came about when working with members, they were like, at Washington Can, they were like, the top issue is housing for us. And so it was very easy for me to throw myself into that, because it was like, I just can remember the anxiety of feeling so close to losing something so critical to your life. And so, yeah, that's why I'm, I guess, doing this.
So yeah, I think that I've always had personally some pretty radical leanings since I was a teenager, but I think that it really kind of blossomed for me in my late 30s with the CID Coalition. I think that we kind of came together in a very grassroots, organic way around a story that Cynthia Brothers had published in The Globalist about a hotel that was going to be built on a piece of land that some local community-based organizations serving seniors and locals had also tried to bid for. And there was supposed to be housing there as well. But a local developer, we suspect with some foreign capital, outbid them. And so they had plans to build, I think, their current plans still maybe stand at about 19 stories, a 19-story hotel. And it's just something that is very unheard of. It's something that I think elders, generations past, activists and organizers in the CID have tried to fight against, but I think that one thing that we come to understand from, some of the information out there around the effects of redlining, have really showed that the effects of what began there are still here. And so in this area where we're kind of, segregated to live, or our ancestors and our elders were segregated to live, now still has, one of the lowest median incomes in the city, approximately $70,000 lower than the city's median income. We skew older, much older. And so we're facing the brunts of pressures of development, and we hear stories often about displacement and gentrification and people working in a lot of service industry, whether it's servicing the sports stadiums where so many folks from out of town come to Seattle to kind of enjoy and partake in. There's a lot of people there behind the scenes making things happen and working just to try to scrape things together for their families, and they're being forced out of the CID. And that's, I think what we've tried to do is really uplift their stories. Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. As we talk about redlining and values and policy, what is the value of understanding the history of redlining? And how can this knowledge shape our current situation as it relates to gentrification, displacement, disenfranchisement of people of color in the Central District and other parts of the county?
Well, I think the importance of understanding the history of something like redlining is that I think it's really important to know the intent of how our community has been shaped and made. And you know, when I think about like something like zoning, you know, and this is something I don't think a lot of folks know, but zoning came about because of a Supreme Court decision that blocked like explicit racist policies around housing. And so the way that cities decided to attack that was saying, oh, we're only going to let a single family zone housing here, which at the time the folks that could afford single family homes, and honestly, which it's still the case now, are white middle class or upper class folks. And that was a way to try to segregate an area with supposedly race neutral policies. And I think that's really important to understand that history. But at the same time, you need to understand what the impact of changing things like that have, because it's like, you know, we could just totally get rid of zoning entirely. I don't think most developers are gonna come around and be like, we're gonna make housing, we're gonna make a bunch of apartments that are affordable for low income folks, because that's not their interest, right? That's not what their intent is. And I think understanding the history of just how communities come to be and like why it's important to protect people, it just helps us create better policy that will keep people housed.
For me, I think one of the aha moments in my life, it was when I was doing the ethnic studies program at University of Washington. One of the last courses I took before I graduated was an African American course with Dr. Al Black. And I just remember, you know, just realizing the structure and historical context and how this affects this, will affect this, will affect this. And I just remember it was, you know, for me, it was one of those aha moments, and I could then look at other things through that same lens. And, you know, and going through that lens, you know, like I had mentioned in Los Angeles, seeing kind of the strategy, the policy, and how it becomes, you know, how these communities are displaced. And then moving back to Seattle, and I actually had before I moved back, I had a job interview in Bothell, and I was like, the prodigal son returns, and I'm good. And so I was so clueless. I was, you know, all my years in LA, and that Bothell became something and expensive, and it was a working class. I moved to Bothell when I was in '82, and so it was very lower middle class, a working class community. My dad was a carpenter, and we could afford to live there. And I was like, wow, I have this master's degree, and I can't afford to live in this community anymore. And so I was, you know, here I was fighting it in LA, and it happened back home. And so then, you know, one of the things that was really important when we meaning my girlfriend, Judy Avitia Gonzalez, who's my partner, I say my partner in love and business. So we run the Panelist Cultural Arts Gallery together. She's a longtime, you know, White Center resident. And when we were looking for a space, we were looking at South King County, which had, you know, this high, you know, immigrant community, a large Latino community, POC community. And we were starting to get some offers like in Beacon Hill, in like Columbia City, to, you know, other space over here. And Judy had just said, you know what, that's what keeps happening to us. You know, that people are getting these opportunities elsewhere, and White Center continues to get screwed over. And I was like, you know what, you're absolutely right. Let's hold off until we find the right space here. Because we wanted to be able to be back in our community. We wanted to do work in our community and fight the gentrification that was starting to happen in White Center. We want to be this cultural arts hub for community and offer these programs. And we tell folks, you know, if you're doing something for community for free, we want to offer you our space for free, and just kind of this network of advocacy and working for each other and with each other. So, you know, I've seen kind of, like, you know, applying what I learned in college to actual direct action and what we're doing. And then, you know, all the other things like the Zapatista idea of autonomous communities and how does that work, and applying them to your own struggles and the fight for social justice.
Historically, I believe that redlining, the popularity of it right now, it's almost fashionable to use the word. But I believe in social engineering. And this country has been into social engineering forever. Call it what you want for the time. But in the context of historical, I always say to anybody who are conservative, why don't you just tell me what happened to Cuba if you don't believe in social engineering? It's like a petri dish right off of our shores, 70 miles, and you can't even get a Chevy part. If you don't believe in social engineering, yesterday on NPR, it's called climate gentrification. What's climate gentrification? Beavis Kane, I used to love the architecture. I like architecture. All of it is at sea level. You have your own canal to your home. That's the wealthy. Well, guess what? The Latin community is 3 feet above sea level. Guess what's happening to the Latin community? Oh, well, all of a sudden that 3 feet's worth a lot more money than that place with the canal. And it was amazing on what they're doing to this community because they want it back now, period. The one thing I will say is that most of us, historically, choose where we want to live. And we want to live with people that are like ourselves. I don't have a problem with that. But what I have a problem with is when I don't get to choose and you tell me where I have to live, period. And that's the difference. Most of us get to choose our neighbors. Most of us, if we're Latino, we want to live with Latinos. But it's another issue when you're told that's where you have to live, and don't you dare sell your home to someone else. And that's what this redlining is. And historically speaking, social engineering, seriously, something new. Redlining, the word made great for my exhibit as far as a title. It's fashionable right now to talk about it. But you know what? We're at a point to where it's almost too late, because money is always trumped in this country good intent. And I'm not a naysay, but it just bothers me. I have sons that are young. They worked hard. One of them a Stanford grad. I'm bragging. Makes good money. But the idea that he has to pay that much money for what? I've got a piece in there called Financially Disenfranchised. And it has a little tent city and a black home at the bottom and high-rise building on top. And all the people in the high-rise point down, they said it's drugs and alcohol. Well, guess what? If you're paying $1,000 a square foot to live in that stereotype building, you have a drug and alcohol problem too. Period. You had to pay that kind of money.
And you know, I wasn't going to ask this, but I think it's important to understand what is lost with gentrification. What happens to communities? What do we lose? And what can we learn from that? What has to happen?
What you lose is the identity and the place that you were pushed and told to live, right? So you lose your home, but you also lose your network. You also lose the social network and the community that helped you when nobody else was helping you. You know, I think that we are still very much in grieving with losing community activists like Donnie Chin, whose murder is still unsolved, and someone who stood up for the community and somebody who was there when emergency services couldn't get there, right? So what does it mean when institutions and systems can't work for you anymore, and your community has to do it? And so when displacement happens, right, and when there's this gentrification, this process of gentrification that leads into displacement, we lose our networks and we lose the stability that we had, and then we are uplifted somewhere else and airlifted somewhere else, and there's nothing there. It's really hard to find, and it's really hard to establish the network that you had that helped provide resources.
Steve, you bring up a good point about the people. It's the people that build the networks, that make the activists. So, if you could talk a little bit too about what is lost, but who are the people who have, made the work possible to fight against gentrification? We have an exhibit on Edwin Pratt here, who was the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle president in the 60s, who was assassinated here in Seattle, major housing advocate, and there are many other pivotal figures, but the ones that who are trying to or try to restore what's been lost and what has been lost.
Me and Steve were talking before, and Steve had asked, what was the kind of the art scene in LA like? And it was this very family, feeling. I mean, I always felt like Norm from Cheers. I'd go in there and it's like, Jake, and you had that kind of sense. And the art that was being created, you just assumed you had to create art as good or better. You're like, okay, this artist just stepped up the game, and now I have to create something amazing. And you fed off each other. You fed off that energy. And now, some of these folks are Grammy winners and big time artists, and so when that you're in danger of losing that kinship, that and it's not just the artists. I mean, it's these organizations, these parent and family organizations that work so hard to create better communities, and to fight gangs and to do all this thing, and they make their communities better. And it's through this kind of sweat, blood, and tears. And it's like, we finally, without any help from the city, we finally made massive change in community. And now, now we're lucrative. Like crap. And so that's the danger, is losing that kinship that you have in those communities. And it was when I moved back to Seattle, it was one of the first things I was looking for, was this sense of community again, and to find that, and and it is one of the reasons why we started, say like the pop-up mercados or Napantla, where to build that place where everyone felt welcome. It's a space for the other that marginalized communities can come in there and feel like, okay, I belong.
It's an identity thing. And I think that's what we agree upon. We lose an identity. But what's ironic is my awareness of, say, redlining or a loss of that community sense started way before it hit the CD area. And that's because one thing I was into always is, like I said, florals, landscaping, so forth. So I really enjoyed the valley. And when I saw the valley disappear, coming up I-5, if you were open, it was amazing on how we didn't catch that or took it serious, of the industrialization of all these wonderful farms, all these people that had communities through Puyallup, Auburn, Kent. And that to me, 30, 40 years ago, was on the radar screen. When I would go to that one nursery that I used to really like, and damn it, it was gone. And you bet, I don't know how to recover it, because you don't. But that loss of community and identity really, really struck me early. I mean, I was in my 20s, and a day out was to drive out to Auburn and enjoy that. And the CD area was lagging behind, not noticing it, because one thing we do, we are so committed to our own communities at times that when it comes to our turn of being heard, We didn't realize it was hurting us because we didn't see it somewhere else. We didn't think it was important somewhere else. It was just fine to put warehouses all the way through Kent. And then all of a sudden, it's our problem. And that loss, I don't know what you do to fix it. But I think it's a sterilization that I don't like.
I also think beyond community and identity, I mean, I really do believe that displacement is life or death for folks. One of the things that I worked on was with a couple folks was going through all of the evictions that happened in Seattle in 2017, which those are the ones that were filed in court, right? It was not all of the ones that happened, it was just the ones that we had public records for. And there were multiple people who died by suicide soon after the eviction notice, like days, right? Or, you know, and the person that found them was the sheriff that was going there to like take them out. And, you know, through my work, like when I think about the people who are like at the forefront of this is like, the people who are the most impacted, I have found are the ones who are always the most willing to put themselves out there and to work with folks and are often thinking about the bigger picture. Like when I think about one of my, I won't say her name because I didn't ask her about this, but when I think about one of my members, the first time I ever talked to her, a lawyer had just suggested that I give her a call because he had met her. And the first time I talked to her, I was on the phone with her while the sheriff was like taking her stuff out of this apartment. And she was still like, we gotta fight back. And she was in the process of becoming homeless, and she was immediately thinking like, bigger picture. Which, I mean, is something like, I'll be honest, I don't know if I could do, right? I think it's rare, and I also get somewhat annoyed whenever it's like you have these big policy changes and it's always elected officials that are talked about in the media and are always like uplifted and as if they're the ones who came up with the idea, which hint, never their ideas. You know, it came from these folks, and the thing that I want to happen, and you know, I think there's some folks here that would probably be down for this, is even if you're not impacted, to like get behind those that are pushing to hold developers accountable, to hold landlords accountable, and even if you might be a homeowner, like throw down with other folks, and that's how like we're going to be able to push back and keep people housed and keep communities together.
May I expand on that? I really, I think that for us with the coalition, we're really seeking to understand and uplift the stories of people who are the most impacted. We try our best to understand some of the privilege that we bring. We are all, again, for the most part, not housing insecure. And so, you know, we have that privilege, but there are so many people in our community and I mean, who are actually facing, again, those economic pressures and being forced to leave. I also, to your point, Leilani, earlier in the question around, you know, who are some of the folks who have kind of led the movement and paved the way and are really taking up the mantle now. Give me a wink if I should stop rattling off some names, but I really do think, you know, for us it's important to build an intergenerational, intercultural movement, an intergeographical movement, and so some things have been easier than others. I think that we've had a more challenging time just due to capacity to be better partners with organizations, movements in the Central District, but we have tried, and I think that we will continue to build with folks like and folks in the South End too, like Got Green, the Don't Displace Dove campaign. Dove herself, an amazing community activist, you know, who supported her community for so long and was again forced to move because of private development. And so within our community as well in Chinatown, we really try to follow in the footsteps of folks like Uncle Bob, who, you know, is having a building built in his memory. So I think it's important to recognize some of the organizations and folks in the community who are trying. I think it's really incredible to recognize Africatown. I have had the fortune to be, I mean, Africatown is amazing. They're really amazing, and I can tell you a little bit, I have an insider view in that I was doing affordable housing development for a little while and had the fortune to actually work and be in the same room with Wai King and his team. And it's amazing to see the way they get things done and how they got it done and what they've achieved. And with the opening of Liberty Bank building, which is also an amazing icon, of Black history in the Central District and in Seattle, and then the next work with Africa Town Plaza, right? So there are a lot of organizations that started with grassroots roots and are continuing to build the capital and take the next step to buy land and to secure land for their community and to build. It takes millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so this is where it gets challenging, right? It's like, how do you gain power and a foothold when it takes so much money and so much coordination to build 110 units, right? Another really terrific organization is the first African-American Methodist Episcopal Housing Corporation, the FAME Housing Corporation, who's working to redevelop Bryant Manor and turn it into 250 units. And they're really trying hard to build family-size units, which is such a big problem and such a big lack in Seattle, but they're really putting in the effort to build up the capital necessary to build 3 and 4 bedrooms so families can come back into the Central District and raise their families. And so I think that those are incredible achievements and that really deserve to be recognized by all of the community and really deserve the kind of support that everyone can give to continue to build these incredible projects and movements.
Something to note too is that most wonderful action that has taken place has happened in coalition across Black, Latinx, Asian communities, and Indigenous Native American communities as well. So I feel the Gang of Four, look up Gang of Four if you haven't already, and see how people have come together over time, because there weren't the numbers in Seattle. For all of us to do it on our own, we had to come together, and that's something that I think there's a lot of strength in. So thank you for bringing that up. Sochi, I want to ask you a little bit about tenant rights and the work and your knowledge in relation to tenant rights and people who are living and the movement for securing and stabilizing tenant rights.
Yeah, well, I think this is probably not a shock to most people, but Washington has a very, very big pro-property rights streak, even in Seattle. And that has resulted in the 70s, there was a remake of the Landlord-Tenant Act, Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, and I think it was pretty much written by the most hard-right landlords. That's my assumption. I wasn't alive at the time, but my theory. And it's interesting how, even just reading the original and what was written in the 70s is they're using words like guilty to, if you're late on your rent, you're guilty, right? The defendant, and things like that. It's very criminalizing poverty, the way it was written. And so because so many people are now forced to be renters, whether you want to or not, because of how expensive housing is, there's been a huge push for just a huge appetite for taking on a lot of these issues, because what we found was that out of looking at all those court records in 2017, most people were evicted for being behind a month or less in rent. So you had one health emergency, missed one day of work, you were just gonna be evicted, you're gonna have that eviction on your record, no landlord's gonna rent to you, and you're likely to become homeless, right? And that was just, that was the path a lot of folks were on. So organized a lot of tenants to change that, right? And not just in Seattle, but throughout the state, right? Because as we've been working on this, I've gotten people from places in Washington that I've never heard of reaching out and being like, hey, we need some to change something, right? And I think it's this beautiful movement that's just fun to be part of. And I think that the thing I like about it is I feel like we're challenging the concept of property rights, right? What is more important, someone's second home, that they're not even they're not creating utility. They just happen to have the capital to buy it. Often they inherited it. It's reinforcing a lot of the really messed up things that have existed about real estate, right? Because my mom immigrated from Mexico in the 60s. She did not inherit any property, right? And so it's But when you look at other folks, because I have also found that a lot of folks who are in the landlord business, not all, tend to inherit the property and then they rent it up for as much as they can, jack up the rent, and are just profiting off of something that they just lucked into. They didn't create this new idea or this new technology, and they're not creating utility. It's just they lucked into this property and they're profiting off of a very basic fundamental human right, and I think that's wrong. But I think being able to challenge that whole concept about like what is more important, someone's profit or someone's like ability to have a safe place to stay. And so, you know, there's going to be stuff being pushed in the Seattle City Council, and Councilmember Herbold is going to be introducing legislation around making sure people can live with their family, because you don't have that right as a renter. My mom could get sick, and if I move her in with me right now, the landlord could evict us because she's an unauthorized occupant. So it's like, I think being aware of all of those dynamics are really important, and having the support from homeowners on changing a lot of this, having support from landlords, because there's some good landlords, you know, I think, I'm just kidding, is really important to help create this stability for folks.
Just clarify for me too, the family, so if family lives with you because they're not on the lease, you can get evicted.
So here's a really quick example. There was a member of ours who, her son turned 18, and the property manager who was 21, her son who was half Peruvian, half black, property manager, a 21-year-old white woman. She went on a power trip. She just didn't like our member's son. And she was like, oh, you're 18? You're an unauthorized occupant. And she tried to evict our member for having an unauthorized occupant. And she was like, where's my high school age son gonna go? And in response, the property manager gave her a list of homeless shelters, right? And that would have been totally legal. Now we organized the building, people came together, and the beautiful thing about landlord issues is that you end up having, you know, multicultural buildings where people don't talk to each other, but then they've got a reason to talk to each other because they have a common enemy. I mean, it's organizing world, it's useful. And we were able to push back and have her back off, but the thing is that would have been legal for her to do. And so that's something that, you know, Councilmember Herbold's going to be pushing to change. So if you think that's cool, you should send a message to the City Council and be like, I like the idea that we're going to protect the right of families to live with families.
Housing discrimination, displacement, and the like are not going to go away anytime soon, but we can do something. So what is it we can do? And also shameless plug for your organizations at this time. That's...
It's part of my exhibit when I speak to people that are viewing it. I point out that although we're at the Black History Museum, and it's mostly about redlining the Central District, it's everyone's problem because it's happening to your grandma or to your brother who are financially disenfranchised. And I really believe that the force of the will of the good of the people eventually rises to the top. But that's only if they bond together. It's not just the black problem. It's not just the problem in Chinatown. It's our problem. If you like Fremont, you want to ride your bicycle naked through Fremont, guess what? You got to work with the people up on Broadmoor, and they have to work with us here at the CD. I stress that in my exhibit. I know that I can come across when I talk about social engineering like it's a downer when I talk about money. Those are realities, and you got to face them. And the only way we face them is together. And I know that's cliche, but it's a point to where it's either us or them. And them is a small number. And one of the things that really bothers me about them, a lot of it is foreign investment. You have to start electing people that had enough. Like I started out earlier, the selling of America, I love this country. But I'm not going to be capitalistic enough to sell my kidney just for the sake of. And we need to work together. And I think that is the only path that's left, period. As long as we're fractured, divided you fall.
I I was that at-risk youth. I was the little gang kid that actually was told in high school I'd be shot and killed before I'd ever graduate high school. Haha, I graduated. But I was very, very fortunate that at that time too, I met Roberto Maestas and went through the youth programs at El Centro, and he ended up being like a second father to me. And at his funeral, I said that he believed in me before I believed in myself. And he would take me to like UFW meetings and introduce me, not as, oh, this is a kid we're helping out. You know, this is my constituent. And so I learned a lot from Roberto, and one of those was that importance of coalition building, and have tried to apply that as much as possible in my own life, and that need to work with other people, other communities, and this sense of like, I will handle this locally, right? I'll handle this issue in my community, and then I'm going to reach out, you know, to you handling it in your community, and we're going to organize together and be stronger. You know, and when I was at University of Washington, it was the same kind of thing, like being at the Ethnic Cultural Center. You know, it was like the Black room was right here, Chicano room right here, Native room was right here, Asian room right here, and we would work and we would organize together. And I actually was at UW during when they were trying to get rid of affirmative action and I-200, and that was like our fight. And so that really brought folks together as well. And so that has stuck with me, and how important it is to reach out to other communities and seek support. And not just seek support and like, hey, we're having this issue, can you help us? But always being there for other communities as well. And I got your back too. You need something, call on us. And so yeah, to this day, you know, that Roberto's impact, you know, has, you know, still is lasting in me.
And the Gang of Four: Roberto Maestas, Bob Santos, Larry Gossett, and Bernie Whitebear.
Well, I guess two things. One, money. Like, the reality is we need an income tax in Washington. We need to actually tax corporations. It is incredibly expensive to build housing, in particular for the lowest income folks. And we are not going to actually, like, we are going to continue to have tens of thousands of people who are homeless until we actually fix our tax system. And so that's one thing. And then just like on a more local individual level, I think it's really important to just actually do the work. And when I say do the work, one thing I've noticed in Seattle, I'll see all the time, like there's like some, you know, coalition of folks who want to sit down and have a conversation about racism, right? But then they don't actually go do the work. They don't actually, and an example of that is like, so my organization, Washington Can't, we're doing an initiative in Federal Way, right? A local tenant rights initiative. And the thing is, if we win that, we're opening the door to a lot of state stuff. It'll be the best place to be a renter, right? When we win it. But the people who got the 9,428 signatures that we had to get were older women with disabilities, were, you know, Black women, you know, and all these folks who, let me tell you, going and door knocking, I got the cops called on me a lot, right? You know who would have probably gotten more signatures in one night? A young white dude that wouldn't have gotten the cops called on him, right? But it is so difficult to get folks to be like, to go do the like dirty work of getting out there. They want to go just have some book club to talk about how they're anti-racist. It just irritates me so much. Like, get like phone bank, door knock, show up.
I think right now it really is about building community. So it really is about knowing your neighbor. It really is about letting others lead and listening to people. I mean, really listening to people. I think for me, with the coalition, the most, the hardest thing, the most, I want to say attractive, but it's not attractive. It's just kind of natural imperative for me to be involved and for us to have kind of come together and grow together is because we have some very shared values, right? And so, you know, through that, we've been able to build a network of organizing and activism. But we've also really done our best, and we haven't always been good at it, but we've done our best to try to let the folks most impacted lead. And I think that that's probably the most critical thing, because anytime that we see a problem, we want to fix it, but going ahead and just trying to do it on our own, that's not going to fix it. In fact, it could probably make it quite worse. And so for myself, I'm actually in a challenging situation in that I've left Seattle, not because I had to, but because I was ready to. And I moved to Tacoma. And so I live on Hilltop now, and I am a grade A gentrifier. And it doesn't feel good, but I think that I have to do my best to start building community with my neighbors. I need to help support, the movements and the actions and the organizations and the community gardens that they have. And so I think that there will be some transition over time with my work with the coalition and my work, hopefully, in my own community. And so I say that in that, you can be somebody who has no clue about a community organization. You can be the different race. You can be another. You can be an outsider. It starts with listening, and it starts with just being in community with people. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, so we've reached that time in the program for a little Q&A. So somebody has a mic, and we'll pass it around. So please raise your hand if you have a question.
Oh, wow. I actually have a historical question about redlining in Seattle, because I grew up in an inner city in Charleston, West Virginia, where redlining worked a little differently. Like, we were lower income, and we were dark-haired and dark-eyed. Turns out that's because we're Melungeon, which is mixed-race Appalachian people. But that was a deep, dark family secret that vanished generations ago. My sister and I had to uncover it. But we were discriminated against. We lived in a neighborhood with Italians and Greek people and Lebanese people. That's where they sold my parents a house, right? And we could never afford to leave. But the blonde, blue-eyed family up the hill, they would leave and they would move to the new gentrifying place, or they would move to the new neighborhoods they were putting in where there used to be forest that were just for white people. So in those places, they had schools. This is very common in the South. The schools are economically segregated. So you get schooling that is the kind of standard that would be in Seattle, but it's for people who have money, and of course they're mostly white because of the property thing, right? So in Seattle, did that happen? Were the schools different and underfunded and crumbling and like the ones I went to?
All of the above.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
I don't think that's a historical thing.
So how did that affect people? I mean, how does that effect linger now? That's a question.
Now, Seattle is known to be probably one of the most prolific places for private schools. And the one that's one of the top, and when you look it up, is Lakeside. Lakeside, probably about what, 40, 50 grand now? And I recall, just for the sake of, and I'll make it quick, 3 years ago, I go down to the Tacoma Dome because Lakeside was in the 3A basketball tournament. They introduced one of their guys, and they said, Bradley is back from his studies in France. That's what happens in Seattle. So you have a two-tier thing. And the only other thing you have is Garfield, who tried to integrate. Well, they came up with an AP program, advanced placement, and only 400 people were eligible. Well, you had 400 that filled Garfield pretty quick because their AP program was really advanced. I know this for a fact because my guys went to West Seattle High School. My guys, with their grades and where they were at, could do Garfield anytime, but we didn't want to commute. And not only that, once it was filled, you can't get in. That was another thing that was wrong with the Seattle school system. I always felt they were ripe for class action because they're not offering the same opportunities. Fortunately for my guys, they did well where they were at. But that's Seattle, the history, pretty much. And that goes for band. If you can really play, you go to Roosevelt, you go to Garfield. If you don't get into Roosevelt or Garfield, you don't win a national title. But if you really want to study, go to Lakeside, Seattle Prep. One more thing real quick. This was a fundraiser 5, 6, 7 years ago. Lakeside's goal was $100 and some million. Bill Gates is a graduate from that. When you do the division of 700 and some kids and their fundraisers for $100 and some million dollars, you look at the advantage of that school. It's amazing. It's really kind of a story that you can't believe.
Seattle parents sued to prevent the consideration of race when using school choice, because there was a time where the school district would help use race to help sort of integrate the schools. Seattle parents sued in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the Supreme Court, the country's Supreme Court, struck down the use of race for that, right? So lefty liberal Seattle parents helped resegregate the school district.
The question's not for me, but as a mother of a recently graduated Seattle public school young person, I think, and knowing a lot of parents, the Seattle public school system, even at this point, is extremely segregated. And that's the public school system, yeah, in many ways.
My question is about living in the CD due to racism, that there's a huge wealth gap between white and black people. So suggestions on where they can put their capital.
Yeah, I would say in addition to Africa Town, Bird Bar Place, I think is a partner with some of the development that Africa Town's doing. Inye's new art Wanawari is a terrific, very grassroots arts organization. Pratt's amazing.
Northwest African American.
Yes, the Northwest African American Museum. It is really an honor to be here, and I think it's really interesting to have this conversation here because this was a contentious space, right? This was a space of contention. So I think that it took an occupation to get this, and so you have to fight, and we have to stop thinking that what we know are answers. And more organizations. I'm still trying to think of more organizations. It's really the black businesses. I'm sorry because it's been a couple months since I've been here, but there was a small black business trying to do wine and cheese right across the street of grocery outlet there, along with a postal service. That's amazing to see these incubators of black excellence and genius coming up in the CD, and to have those opportunities, to have the opportunity with Christy Brown at the with that brown girl cooks at the bottom of Africa Town. I think that supporting those businesses, which should really have our opportunity right now to flourish, is going to be very important.
I'm also a huge believer in systemic change, so get involved in the local elections, especially this year, because ultimately a lot of these things are going to be solved through political change.
I work in nonprofit. I work for the People of Color Against AIDS Network, which is also known as POCAN.
Mm-hmm.
We've been around for almost 30 years, and we provide so many resources to the community because primarily, starting off, black women were dealing with that health disparity, so it was up for them to figure it out. Throughout that space, we have about 9 programs. Well, out of those 9 programs, we have 2 that are working within the housing space. So one of the problems that I've noticed that I've had in the past year of working there is that we get these grants. And what they say to you is, here POCAN, here ARTH, here I can't think of any, here's Centro de la Raza, y'all share these grants. What suggestions do you have towards the big naysayers, or to even me, so that I can go back and tell my community so we can get more housing resources that are available? Because what they'll do is they'll say, well, this is just for single mothers. But then I have my twin brother who has 3 kids. There's no housing resources available for him. So what do you suggest? And I primarily try to keep people of color in King County because we help build it as well. But I'm asking you guys, what are your suggestions for that?
What can be done is to try to push the county and the city to centralize resources, to get rid of these weird check boxes that people are supposed to fit, because no one does, right? Is the single mom somehow more important than the elderly disabled woman without children? It's just a weird sort of way that we're trying to break people down into some weird check boxes.
Also, primarily within our LGBTQ community.
Right.
A lot of it's primarily if you have a health disparity you're able to get the resources. But almost 70% of teens of color that are LGBTQ are homeless, and there's not any resources that are available. Yeah, you have Lambert House, but if you look at the demographic of where that is, primarily POCs don't see POCs in those spaces, so then they're back homeless. And it's still about the cultural space, so I just also wanted to put that out there. It's not just about the color, it's also about the sexuality, but I hope that we as a community can focus on the integrity of all of us here, because we're losing out.
Right, and I mean, I think the reality is like when I think about the folks who are determining how money gets spent, they're not people who are impacted. And I think they have really good intent, but they're not thinking about how does this work in reality. So whatever we can do to really push people, I mean, just on a pragmatic level, like push the county and city to create a centralized resource, you're gonna save a lot on overhead too. It's like a very pragmatic thing. So that, I guess, would be good. And then also just prioritizing the impacted people.
So with Spokane, I'm not sure if they were still a part of the project, the affordable housing project that they're seeking to build for LGBTQ elders on Capitol Hill. But I think that coalitions like that, or any opportunity where capital can be shared and leveraged, is going to be very critical, because it does take a lot, and we're really paying a lot right now, not just for land. We're paying a lot for land, but construction costs are really through the roof. And so I think that in terms of housing, there's also, in terms of Spokane, I don't know, I think you guys do some housing kind of navigation as well, housing locator work. I think that's critical. And so being able to put resources and support their galas, support their fundraisers. I mean, please go out and find where you can plug in, especially those these resources, these financial resources, to support efforts where people are legitimately trying to build housing units. And those are what are going to save our communities.
I'm a 57 graduate of Garfield High School in Warren. I really acknowledge what you went through with respect to the psychological, emotional trauma of growing up and trying to figure out who and what you were all about. I can relate to that, having graduated from Garfield when it was quote unquote the showcase of democracy, but you couldn't date the ladies from Madison Park, and that was a reality. But my question is, and by the way, I just want to also mention in terms of housing, my father brought a lawsuit against the state of Washington and won, Decano versus the state of Washington, and he won it allowing Filipino Americans to own land in the state of Washington legally. So this was in 1941, so the fight continues. And my question is, having grown up with some kids from Broadmoor, is my understanding correct that they had covenants with respect to buying a home in Broadmoor? And if so, are they still recognized, or have they been, they're not recognized any longer? And so my historical data has been updated. Thank you very much.
Racial covenants exist in deeds, like you can still see them sometimes in deeds, but they're not legally enforceable, I guess would be and racial covenants meaning, oh, you can't sell this piece of property to someone who is black or whatever. Like they would put that in deeds, which is really messed up, obviously, but it's not enforceable.
And if you go to the Segregated Seattle page, you can read them, and I implore everybody, especially white folks, to go home and read them, because they're the most dehumanizing thing that you'll ever come across. And you will cry, and you should cry, because it's terrible. It is terrible.
What's the site?
Segregated Seattle is the name of the site. And they have they have copies and scans of the old deeds with all of the racial covenants where they're referring to your fellow people that you're sitting next to in the most dehumanizing terms.
Hello, my name is Marissa Martinez. I'm a part of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. And I would like to say that
the
International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. And I would like to say that white people owe reparations for redlining, and they owe reparations for gentrification. And right now, the debate about reparations to African people is happening right now, but the amount would be $14.1 trillion. So that puts it in perspective. You know, this is parasitic capitalism, and from day one, it was homelessness for the Duwamish tribe. You know, from day one, it's been about, you know, ethnically cleansing people. So when we think of gentrification, it's the slow death of the Black and brown indigenous communities.
My name is Latifa. I'm a recent graduate at Garfield High School, and I wanted to ask, how can we help our young youth get mentorship about stopping these topics like discrimination against minorities, gentrification, homelessness, housing in South King County, and how does raising awareness, protesting really help us become aware about redlining in schools and in our communities?
Well, if you want to get involved in a grassroots community organization, that's pretty awesome, called Washington Can. You can hit me up, and you know, I think like getting involved in organizing, the crux of it is just like working with people, developing your leadership skills, and challenging power. And as far as like how do protest rallies and things like that work? They work when you have a target that you are challenging and putting on notice, right? Like I think you can have a rally outside and you might raise some awareness, but like, man, let's just go to some landlord's house and protest outside and tell him to change something, because that's how I think that you put pressure, you shame people. Like, I think a lot of poor folks have shame for being poor, and it's time to flip that, and I think we should be putting a lot of shame on people with a lot of wealth.
I worked in higher ed for about 15 years before I became a full-time artist. And so when we opened up Napantla, it was working with youth was something I didn't want to give up. So we do have the Próxima Generación Youth Artist Residency Program. We meet every other Wednesday, and we bring in a cultural bearer each session that teaches the youth a new art form, whether it's photography, folklorico dancing, hip hop dancing, the music industry, painting, muralism. So that's one way to get involved as far as the arts. El Centro de Raza had a great youth program, and that's where what I went through. Get involved in different local youth arts, or not arts, just youth programs. I know Northwest Folk Life, their program this year was Youth Rising, and one of the things they created was the Hydrant, which is like a youth led activism inspiring kind of program. So things like that. And as far as if you want to talk more, I'd be happy to talk with you more afterwards as well, and kind of see what kind of other resources I can help you out with, and folks.
I think that Got Green has a youth organizing program. I know that Interim CDA in the Chinatown International District has a youth organizing program. I highly encourage finding your voice and leveraging your voice, especially for youth. I think that don't let anybody tell you that what you think doesn't matter, because you're the one. We need youth to help tell us, what we're doing wrong. Because I think that we really lose sight of our values, right? So I think that the youth voice and kind of managing and holding on to that, and you had mentioned protests and activism. Find your group. Find the people in the community that will build with you. If you have to do some research and find another organization, that's great. But if you have a natural network, use your network of friends and learn and build your knowledge base together, and build some power together with your group. Because I think that when the going gets tough, and when we're told that we don't know what we're talking about, or we don't know about the complexities of housing development. I do know about the complexities of housing development. I'm going to tell you it's bullshit. And so what matters more are the stories and the lived experiences of people like yourself and other people of color in the room. So never lose sight of that, and just keep building from there.
Thank you.
say?
So my name's Erica. I'm a senior at the University of Washington down in Tacoma. So at first, I want to thank everybody who hosted this. It's really cool. I like that it brings the community together, even us Tacoma people all the way up here just for these conversations. But I have two quick questions. So my first question is, how do you explain the collateral consequences that still impact community, people of color communities today, with those people who say like, my ancestors did that, not me, those type of mentalities? And then also, how do you explain the accumulating wealth privileges, such as being a homeowner versus a renter, and how that increases your net worth? So an example of that is like, instead of paying rent, you're paying a mortgage, which your mortgage is essentially like a savings account, because then you don't have to worry about paying rent every single month, and then that gets your mortgage, your property, your houses, that gets down to from generation to generation. So then your kids don't have to worry about how are they going to pay for college, because they're not also stressing about rent, things like that. How do you go about explaining these certain things to our allies? Thank you.
I can speak more to the first one. And I think when I talked about that aha moment in Dr. Al Black's class, it was really relating to that, and this kind of putting the pieces together of, it wasn't just about this one incident like slavery and then it was all fine, kind of, that there's historical exploitation that happens, that continues to happen. And I think it's recognizing, for folks, recognizing privilege, that it does, just because, your ancestor or someone else, may be responsible for race, like slavery, you're benefiting from exploitation today. And, about white privilege and these other systemic problems. And when you can put things in perspective, I think it becomes more easily digestible, and you can explain, I think better, and it makes more sense. And it's not, an easy step to take, right? I mean, yeah, I'm Mexican, but I'm like the whitest Mexican you'll meet, right? I mean, I have white privilege. And I have to accept that, and it's kind of a hard pill to swallow. Like, but I'm Mexican. Like, no, but I'm a very light-skinned Mexican, and I have more privileges than, say, my very indigenous-looking grandfather, right? And I think when we can digest that, when we can accept that, and not just, I think, and it goes for, privilege in multifaceted ways, whether it's, being, cis male, whether it's being male, or these other privileges that I have. It's not just saying like, yeah, you're underprivileged. It's saying I'm overprivileged. And how do you use that? How can you use your privilege to benefit others? And how can you use your privilege to, make the lives of other folks better, and without overstepping as well?
There will be plenty of opportunity to follow up after the program. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. And I'm going to say this is a little different as a moderator, but if you are white in the audience, this is a lot to process, and I ask that you please ask permission and/or please process this with people only if you are invited, especially people of color. We do a lot of educating, and that takes a lot of burden oftentimes, so please acknowledge that part of our community care. With that being said, thank you to everyone here on the panel. Thank you to all of you for coming to this program this evening. We're going to end with the youth and the hope for the future, and your future action in this area. Thank you.